I thought stealing a piece of bread would cost me my job, but I didn't know it would make the most dangerous man in the city look at me like I'd betrayed him. The security camera above the kitchen door blinked red at 2:07 a.m., steady, silent, unforgiving, and I kept my head down anyway, fingers trembling as I wrapped the last slice of roast chicken in a napkin that wasn't mine to use. The marble counters behind me gleaming under soft gold lights, everything in this house too perfect, too untouched, like no one here ever felt hunger, not real hunger, not the kind that makes your hands shake and your chest tighten and your thoughts blur into one desperate need to keep someone else alive. I checked the hallway once, twice, listening past the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of a grandfather clock somewhere deep in the estate, counting seconds like they mattered, like time could protect me, and then I slipped the food into my apron pocket, flattening it against my hip. As if that could make it invisible, the Kane estate stretched over nearly 10,000 square feet, all polished stone and quiet power, the kind of place where footsteps echoed even when you tried to walk softly, and I had learned every blind spot, every corner where the cameras didn't quite reach, except this one, the one above the kitchen door that I pretended didn't exist because thinking about it made everything harder. You shouldn't be here this late, a voice said once in my memory, low and controlled. The first time I'd seen him, Alexander Kane, standing at the end of a hallway like he owned not just the house but the air inside it, and I had nodded, whispered an apology, kept my eyes down because that's what people like me do when men like him look at us. Now, 2 weeks later, I was still here, still breaking rules that weren't written but understood, still taking things that weren't mine. And every step I took away from the kitchen felt heavier than the last. I moved through the corridor toward the east wing, the part of the house no one talked about, where the lights stayed dim and the doors stayed closed, where even the other staff avoided going unless they were told, and I told myself again what I always told myself, that I wasn't stealing, not really, that I was just moving something from one place to another, that it mattered where it ended up, that it mattered who needed it. My heart pounded louder as I reached the corner, my breath catching when I heard footsteps somewhere behind me, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain, the kind of steps that belonged to someone who never had to hurry for anything, and I froze for half a second before forcing myself to keep walking, because stopping would look guilty and guilt was something people like him could smell. The door to the east wing stood just ahead, slightly open, a thin line of darkness waiting for me to slip through, and I tightened my grip on the fabric of my apron, feeling the warmth of the food still there, still real, still something I could give, something that mattered more than the rules of a house built on silence and control. I didn't look back, not when the footsteps paused, not when the air behind me seemed to shift, not even when a quiet voice cut through the hallway like it had been waiting for this exact moment, calm, certain, and impossible to ignore. Stop. I froze the second he said it, the word wrapping around my spine like something heavier than fear, and I could feel his presence before I even turned, the air shifting, tightening, like the house itself knew who had just stepped into the hallway. I closed my eyes for half a second, steadying my breath, telling myself to move, to run, to say something, but my body did not listen. It never did when authority spoke that quietly, that calmly, because calm meant certainty and certainty meant there was no room left to escape. I turned slowly, my fingers still pressed against the fabric of my apron, and there he was, standing 10 feet away, exactly where the shadows met the light, tall, composed, wearing a dark suit that looked untouched by the hour or the silence of the house, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on me like he had already decided something I had not yet heard. "What are you doing in this part of the house?" he asked, his voice even, not raised, not rushed, just controlled, and somehow that made it worse, because anger could be negotiated but calm could not. I opened my mouth, closed it again, my thoughts scattering, searching for something safe, something believable, something that would not sound like the truth because the truth would only make things worse. "I was just finishing up in the kitchen," I said finally, the words too soft, too careful, and I hated how small they sounded the moment they left me. His gaze did not move, did not soften, and for a second I wondered if he could hear my heartbeat from across the hallway, if he could see the outline of what I was hiding just by looking at me. He took a step closer, slow, deliberate, and the distance between us shrank in a way that made my chest tighten, not because he moved fast, but because he did not need to, because every step carried weight, intention, authority that did not ask permission. "At 2 in the morning, he said, more a statement than a question. And I nodded before I could stop myself, as if agreeing would somehow make it less suspicious. His eyes dropped briefly, not to my face, but to my hands, to the way I held my apron just a little too tightly, and I knew then that he had already noticed, already seen more than I wanted him to see. "Show me," he said, and this time there was no space between the words, no softness, just a quiet command that settled into the floor beneath us. My throat tightened, and for a moment I considered lying again, pretending, deflecting, anything that would buy me time, but something in his expression told me it would not matter, that he would not ask twice, that whatever came next had already been decided. I slowly loosened my grip, my fingers trembling as I reached into the pocket and pulled out the folded napkin, the warmth still faint against my skin, and held it out like it might explain itself if I did not speak. His eyes flicked down to it, then back to me, and something shifted. Not surprise, not yet, just a deeper kind of focus. Like he was placing pieces together in a pattern I could not see. "You are taking food," he said, and I nodded again, because denying it now would only make me look worse, and worse was not something I could afford. Silence stretched between us, heavy, waiting, and I could feel the weight of everything I had done pressing against this one moment, this one decision that could undo all of it. "From my house," he added, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes for the first time, because looking away felt like admitting something I was not ready to say out loud. "Yes," I said, barely above a whisper, and the word hung there, fragile, exposed, irreversible. He studied me for a long second, then another, his expression still controlled, still unreadable, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer but sharper in a way that made my chest tighten all over again. "People do not take what is not theirs unless they believe they have no other choice," he said, and I felt something crack inside me at the quiet certainty in his tone, because he was wrong, and he was right, and I did not know which part would matter more when he decided what to do with me. I could feel his words settle into me like they were meant to stay there, like they were not just an observation but a judgment already forming, and I held on to the edge of my apron again, not to hide anything this time, but to keep my hands from shaking, because if they shook, it would confirm everything he already believed. "I am not selling it," I said quietly, the sentence slipping out before I could stop it, and for a second I regretted speaking at all, because explaining always made things worse in places like this, where people with power did not need explanations to decide what was true. His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he had just found something worth paying attention to, and that shift alone made my chest tighten, because attention from him felt heavier than accusation. "Then why take it?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice now, not softer, not kinder, just more precise, like he was cutting closer to something he wanted to understand, even if he had already decided I was wrong. I swallowed, the answer sitting right there in my throat, simple, honest, dangerous, and I knew the moment I said it, everything would change. Because truth in a place like this was not always protection, sometimes it was exposure, because someone needed it, I said, and the silence that followed felt louder than anything we had said so far, stretching between us like it was waiting for him to decide whether that answer meant anything at all. He did not respond immediately, and that was worse than if he had, because his silence was never empty. It was always thinking, always calculating, always measuring the space between what I said and what he believed. He took another step closer, close enough now that I could see the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, the kind that came from control, not from laughter, and I forced myself not to look away, even though every instinct told me to lower my gaze, to make myself smaller, to disappear into the polished floor beneath us. "Who?" he asked, and the word was quiet, but it landed heavier than anything else, because this was the moment where I either protected what mattered or protected myself, and I knew I could not do both. My fingers tightened around the napkin, feeling the slight warmth that remained, the last trace of something I had promised I would bring, something that mattered more than whatever consequences came next, and I shook my head slowly, not in defiance, but in refusal, because saying it out loud would turn it into something he could control, something he could take away. His expression changed then, just slightly. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something more distant, like a door closing behind his eyes, and I felt the shift immediately, the space between us no longer uncertain but decided. "You understand what this looks like," he said, and I nodded, because I did, because from where he stood, there was no version of this that made sense, no version that did not end with me being exactly what he thought I was. "Yes," I said, my voice steady now in a way that surprised even me, because once the truth settled, fear had less room to move, and I realized I was not afraid of him the way I had been before. I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped doing what I was doing. He watched me for another long second, searching. weighing, and then he turned his head slightly, just enough to signal something unseen, something beyond me, and I felt it before I heard it, the quiet activation of the system above us, the camera still blinking red, still recording, still capturing every second of this moment that was already slipping out of my control. "We will review the footage," he said, his voice returning to that calm, controlled tone that left no room for argument. And my heart dropped, not because I had been caught, but because the footage would show everything, not just this hallway, not just this moment, but the path I had taken, the door I had opened, the place I had gone, the one place in this house he had not thought to look in a very long time, and for the first time since he stepped into the hallway, I felt something stronger than fear rise in my chest, not panic, not regret, but the quiet certainty that once he saw it, once he understood where the food had gone, nothing about this night would stay the same. The walk to his office felt longer than it should have, even though it was probably less than 50 feet, the sound of my own footsteps echoing too loudly against the polished floors while he moved beside me without a sound, like he had done this 1,000 times before and never once questioned where it would end. I kept my eyes forward, not because I was brave, but because looking at him made it harder to breathe, and I needed every steady breath I could get before whatever came next. The office door opened without him touching it, one of the guards I had not even noticed stepping back silently as we entered, and the room inside was exactly what I expected. Dark wood, clean lines, everything in its place, a space designed for decisions that did not get undone. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either, and I obeyed without thinking, lowering myself into the chair across from his desk while he remained standing for a moment, watching me like he was still deciding what I was worth. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, and I felt my stomach tighten as the security system loaded, rows of timestamps, angles, every corner of the house laid out in quiet surveillance, nothing missed, nothing forgotten, except maybe the one place that mattered. He did not rush, did not click immediately. Instead he walked around the desk and sat down slowly, folding his hands together as if this was a meeting, as if I was something to be reviewed instead of judged, and somehow that made it worse. "You understand that trust is not something given lightly here," he said, his voice calm, measured, and I nodded because there was nothing else to do, because arguing with a man like him was like arguing with gravity, pointless and exhausting. He selected the first clip, and the screen showed the kitchen, the exact moment I had wrapped the food, my movement smaller than I remembered, more nervous, more obvious, and I felt heat rise to my face as I watched myself become proof of everything he believed. "Again," he said quietly, and the footage skipped forward, showing another night, another moment, my hands moving the same way, my body following the same path. And I realized then that this was not the first time he had noticed, just the first time he had decided to act. The clips continued, one after another, each one building a pattern I could not deny, a story that made sense from his side, a story where I took without explanation, without permission, without reason. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers pressed together so tightly they ached, because reacting would only make it worse, because I needed him to keep watching, to follow it all the way through. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen, and for the first time since this started, I saw something like uncertainty flicker beneath the control, just a fraction, just enough to tell me that the pattern he expected was not quite complete. "Pause," he said, and the footage froze on the moment I stepped out of the kitchen, the napkin hidden against my side, and his gaze shifted from the screen to me, searching again, questioning without asking. "Where do you go next?" he asked, and I did not answer, not because I could not, but because I knew the answer was already there, waiting for him to see it for himself. He studied me for a second longer, then turned back to the screen and resumed the footage, following my movements through the hallway, past the main corridor, toward the part of the house no one paid attention to, and I felt my heartbeat slow, not from relief, but from something steadier, something that had nothing to do with fear anymore. The video tracked me as I reached the east wing door, as I slipped inside without hesitation, and I watched him lean forward slightly, just enough to show that this was not what he expected, that this was not part of the story he had already written about me. The screen showed me disappearing into the dim hallway beyond, the door closing softly behind me, and the room fell quiet again except for the low hum of the system, the moment hanging there, unfinished, waiting for what came next. And for the first time since he told me to stop, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest, because whatever happened after this, whatever he decided when he saw the rest, at least the truth was no longer something I had to carry alone. The next clip began without sound, just the grainy clarity of a hallway that almost no one in the house ever entered, and I watched as the version of me on the screen moved without hesitation, like she had done it before, like she knew exactly where she was going, and I could feel his attention sharpen beside me, not shifting away, not dismissing it, but locking onto it with the kind of focus that made everything else in the room disappear. The camera angle changed as the system followed the corridor, dim lighting casting long shadows along the walls, and then there it was, the door at the far end, slightly worn compared to everything else in the house, a detail that did not belong in a place where perfection was the standard. I saw his hand tighten just slightly against the armrest, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me, because I had been watching him as closely as he had been watching the screen. Waiting for the moment something shifted, the footage showed me pausing at the door, just for a second, like I always did, like I was reminding myself why I was there, and then I pushed it open and stepped inside. The system switched to the interior camera, older, lower resolution, one that had probably not been checked in a very long time, and the room came into view slowly, not dramatic, not shocking, just quiet, small compared to the rest of the estate, with a single bed near the window and a chair pulled close beside it. The woman in the bed barely moved at first, her figure thin beneath the blanket, her face turned slightly toward the light. And I felt something in the room change beside me, not loud, not sudden, just a stillness that had not been there before. On the screen, I approached her carefully, the same way I had every night, placing the folded napkin on the small table before gently sitting down, my movement slower now, softer, like the house outside that room did not exist at all. The footage showed me speaking, though there was no audio, my lips moving in quiet words that only she could hear, and then I helped her sit up, steady, patient, offering the food piece by piece like it was something precious, something that could not be rushed. She took it slowly, her hands weak but careful, and even through the screen I could see the way her expression changed, not just hunger easing, but something deeper, something like recognition, like she knew she was not alone in that moment. I glanced at him then, just for a second, and saw it, the crack in the control he had held so tightly since this began, the faint shift in his eyes as he watched a version of his world he had not been paying attention to, a part of his house that had been existing without him. The footage continued, showing me adjusting the blanket around her shoulders, checking the glass of water, making sure everything within reach was where she could use it, small things, simple things, things that should have been obvious but somehow were not. The room stayed quiet, the screen flickering softly, and for a long moment neither of us said anything, because there was nothing left to accuse, nothing left to explain. Only the truth sitting there in front of him, undeniable and complete. And when the clip ended, when the screen returned to stillness, I realized that the silence in the office had changed, no longer heavy with suspicion, but something else entirely, something fragile, something that had not been there when he first told me to stop. He did not move when the screen went dark, not immediately, and that was the first time I understood that silence could mean something entirely different, not control, not judgment, but hesitation, like the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make him reconsider where he was standing. I kept my eyes on the desk, on the clean lines of the wood, because looking at him now felt too personal. Like I would be seeing something I was not supposed to see, something he did not let anyone see. The room stayed still except for the quiet hum of the system, and I could feel the weight of everything we had just watched settling into the space between us. No longer a question, no longer an accusation, just a truth that had already taken its place. How long? He said finally, and his voice was different, not softer exactly, but less certain, like each word had to pass through something heavier before it reached the air. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time since the footage ended, and for a moment I did not recognize the expression there, because it was missing the certainty that had defined him before. A few weeks, I answered, my voice steady, not because I was not afraid, but because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to protect except the reason I had done it. He looked back at the screen, now blank, as if expecting it to change, to show something else, something that would make sense of it in a way that did not leave him standing here like this. No one reported it, he said, more to himself than to me, and I realized then that in his world, everything important was documented, tracked, controlled, and the idea that something this significant had existed outside of that system did not fit. No one goes there, I said quietly, and the words felt simple, but they carried more than that. They carried the distance, the silence, the part of the house that had been forgotten because it was easier that way. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to restraint, like he was holding back a reaction he had not decided how to show. She should not have been left like that, I added, before I could stop myself, and the moment the sentence left my mouth, I knew I had crossed a line, not in what I had done, but in what I had said, because I was no longer just explaining, I was judging, and people like me were not supposed to do that to people like him. The silence returned, sharper now, more defined, and I felt it immediately. The shift back toward something dangerous. Something controlled, but it did not land the way I expected it to. Instead of responding, he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting against the desk, his eyes no longer avoiding the truth but fixed on it, steady, searching, like he was forcing himself to see something he had spent a long time not seeing. You continued anyway, he said, and this time it was not an accusation, not even a question. Just a statement that held something else beneath it, something I could not quite name. I nodded, because there was no reason not to, because stopping had never been an option once I understood what was happening behind that door. Why? He asked, and the word felt different now, not sharp, not demanding, just quiet, like he genuinely needed the answer. I took a breath, the kind that settles everything for just a second, and said the only thing that had ever made sense to me, because she was hungry, and the simplicity of it hung there between us, unprotected, undeniable, stripping away everything else, every assumption, every conclusion he had built before this moment. He did not respond right away, and I watched as something shifted again behind his eyes, not breaking, not collapsing, but changing, like a structure being rebuilt from the inside out, and for the first time since this started, I felt something unfamiliar replace the fear that had been sitting in my chest all night. Not relief, not safety, just the quiet understanding that whatever he said next would not come from the same place it had before. He stood up so suddenly that the chair behind him barely made a sound, but the movement itself carried weight, not anger, not loss of control, just urgency, like something inside him had shifted from thinking to needing to act, and for a second I did not know if I should follow or stay where I was, because nothing about him felt predictable anymore. Show me, he said, and this time it was not a command shaped by authority, it was something closer to insistence, something personal, and I rose from the chair without hesitation, my heartbeat steady in a way that surprised me, because the fear that had been there before had been replaced by something else, something quieter but stronger. We walked back through the hallway together, the same distance as before, but it felt different now, the silence no longer heavy with suspicion but filled with something unresolved, something waiting to be faced. The guard stepped aside without a word as we passed, their presence still there, still watchful, but distant compared to what was happening between us, and I realized then that whatever this was, it had nothing to do with them anymore. The east wing door came into view, slightly open just like before, and I slowed for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of respect, because what was behind that door was not something to be rushed into, not something to be handled the way everything else in this house was handled. He did not wait, did not hesitate, he pushed the door open and stepped inside first, and I followed, watching as his gaze adjusted to the dim light, taking in the room the way someone sees something for the first time and realizes they should have seen it long ago. She was there, just like in the footage, sitting upright this time, her shoulders thin beneath the blanket, her hands resting quietly in her lap, and when she looked up, her eyes found him immediately, not with fear, not with surprise, but with a kind of recognition that felt older than this moment, older than the distance that had been between them. He stopped a few feet from the bed, and for the first time since I had met him, he did not seem like the man who controlled everything around him. He seemed like someone who had walked into a part of his own life he did not fully understand anymore. Mom, he said, and the word was soft, almost uncertain, like he was not sure if he still had the right to say it, and the room seemed to hold its breath around that single sound. She smiled then, faint but real, and reached out her hand just slightly, not demanding, not expecting, just offering, and I saw his posture shift in a way that no one outside this room would ever believe, the control loosening, the distance collapsing into something much more fragile. I stepped back quietly, giving them space without being asked, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to me, even though I had been part of how it happened. He moved closer to her, slower now, like every step mattered, like he was measuring the distance not in feet but in time, in everything that had been missed, everything that had been left behind. You have not been eating, he said, and his voice carried something I had not heard before, not authority, not certainty, but something closer to regret, and she only shook her head gently, her eyes still on him, calm in a way that did not match the weight of what was being said. She made sure I did, she added, her voice quiet but steady, and I felt his gaze shift toward me for a brief second, not sharp, not accusing, just acknowledging, like he was seeing me differently now, not as a problem to be solved, but as something he had not understood. The room settled into a silence that was no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but filled with something that had not existed before, something that could not be undone by control or rewritten by power. And as I stood there, just outside the center of it, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever decisions he made after this moment, they would come from a place that had only just been opened, a place where the truth had finally reached him, not through words, but through what he had chosen not to see until now. The room did not move, but everything inside it felt different now, like the air had shifted to make space for something that had been missing for a long time, and I stayed near the doorway, quiet, careful not to interrupt the fragile connection forming in front of me. He sat down beside her slowly, not with the confidence he carried everywhere else, but with a kind of hesitation that made the distance between them feel heavier than the few feet that remained. "Why did no one tell me?" he said, and his voice was low, not directed at me, not even fully directed at her, but somewhere in between, like he was asking the room itself to answer for everything that had been overlooked. She looked at him with the same calm expression, her hand resting lightly against the blanket, and there was no accusation in her eyes, no anger, just a quiet understanding that felt older than the silence that had separated them. "You were busy building your world," she said softly, and the words settled in a way that did not push, did not blame, but still carried weight, the kind that did not disappear just because it was spoken gently. He exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before returning to her face, and I could see it then, the realization not as something sudden, but as something unfolding, piece by piece, as if each second here was forcing him to see a version of himself he had not allowed before. "That does not excuse this," he replied, and his tone held something steadier now, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest in a way that felt new. And she gave a small nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that the truth did not need to be softened to be understood. His attention shifted toward me then, not sharp, not questioning, but direct, and I felt the weight of it in a different way than before, not as pressure, but as recognition, like he was placing me somewhere new in his understanding. "You should have reported it," he said, and I held his gaze for a moment before answering, because this part mattered, not for me, but for what came after. "She asked me not to," I said quietly, and I saw the slight change in his expression, the way his eyes flicked back to her, searching for confirmation, for context, for something that would explain why silence had been chosen over help. She met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady despite everything. "I did not want to be moved again," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made the room feel smaller, not physically, but emotionally, like the weight of past decisions had followed her into this moment. He did not respond right away, and I could see the conflict settle into him, not loud, not visible to anyone who did not know what to look for, but there, present, shaping every thought behind his eyes. "You will not be moved," he said finally, and the certainty in his voice had returned, but it was different now, not built on control, but on something else, something that felt more deliberate, more considered. She watched him for a long second, then gave a small nod, the kind that did not celebrate, did not react strongly, but accepted what was being offered because it mattered. I shifted my weight slightly, preparing to step back, to leave them to whatever came next, because my part in this felt finished, and I knew staying would only take something away from the moment they were rebuilding. "Emily," he said before I could move, my name stopping me in place because it was the first time he had used it without distance, without formality, and I turned back slowly, meeting his gaze as he stood from the chair. "You will not be dismissed," he continued, and the words landed heavier than I expected, not because I had been afraid of losing the job, but because of what they meant, the shift they represented, the acknowledgement of something beyond what had happened. I nodded once, not trusting myself to say anything that would not break the balance of the room, and stepped back toward the hallway, leaving the door slightly open behind me, because closing it felt like ending something that was still in the process of being repaired. And as I walked away, the silence that followed me was no longer something to fear, but something that held the quiet echo of a truth finally seen. I did not expect the house to feel different the next morning, but it did, not louder, not brighter, just quieter in a way that felt more deliberate, like something unseen had shifted its place within the walls. I moved through the kitchen at my usual time, my hand steady as I prepared the trays, measuring portions the way I always did, but there was a pause now, a moment where I found myself waiting, listening. As if the silence itself had changed its meaning overnight, no one mentioned what had happened, not the staff, not the guards, not even the house manager who usually noticed everything, and I understood that some things in this place did not need to be spoken to be known, that certain truths moved quietly, reshaping things without announcement. I finished arranging the dishes and turned toward the east wing, the path as familiar as my own reflection. But when I reached the door, I stopped, not out of hesitation, but because it was already open, wider than before, as if the space inside was no longer meant to be hidden. I stepped in slowly, my eyes adjusting to the soft light, and saw him there, seated beside the bed again, not in a suit this time, not with the distance he carried so naturally, but in a simple shirt, his posture relaxed in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like a version of him that existed only in this room. She was speaking softly, her voice steady, and he was listening, not interrupting, not directing, just listening in a way that made the space between them feel smaller than it had the night before. I stayed near the doorway, unsure if I should enter, but he noticed me anyway, his gaze lifting briefly, not sharp, not questioning, just acknowledging, and there was something in that look that told me I was no longer an outsider to this moment. "You came," she said gently, her eyes shifting toward me with a warmth that made everything else fade for a second, and I nodded, stepping forward just enough to place the tray on the small table, my movements quieter than usual, as if I did not want to disturb the balance that had formed here. "She always does," he replied, and the words were simple, but they carried something new, something that had not been there before, something that felt like recognition rather than observation. I glanced at him briefly, just long enough to see that the certainty in his expression had changed, not gone, but reshaped, less rigid, less distant, and I realized then that the night before had not just revealed something to him, it had changed the way he saw everything that followed. He stood after a moment, stepping back to give me space, not out of command, but out of understanding, and I moved closer to the bed, adjusting the blanket, checking the water, the same routine as always, but now it felt different, not hidden, not secret, just part of something that was allowed to exist. "Emily," he said again, and I turned slightly, meeting his gaze without the hesitation that had once been there, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because whatever